Okay, welcome back. We're talking about verbs again, and we're going to move on from transitive to intransitive verbs. But I'm going back to the beginning of my last video and just reviewing with you about verbs in general. So remember, we said that verbs can be divided into two major categories. The first category, which is on the left of the flowchart, is action verbs. Remember, these are things that we're actually doing. We can see these actions happening. So laughing, clapping, jumping, twirling, those are all action verbs. And then on the right side of our flowchart is linking. And linking verbs are things like the verb to be. Am, are, is, was, were, be, being, been. I am tired. I was sleepy. Those are linking verbs. Now, linking verbs cannot take this characteristic of being transitive or intransitive. The only verbs that can be transitive or intransitive are action verbs. Because remember, what we're talking about is whether or not the verb is transferring the action from the subject to an object. So for there to be any kind of a transference at all, it has to be an action verb. Yesterday, or maybe just a few minutes ago, you watched the video about transitive verbs. And remember, transitive verbs are action verbs that have a direct object. And we talked about Mom baking cookies, Sam hitting the ball. So it's very obvious that we have the subject performing an action and a receiver of that action. Another word for receiver, of course, is the direct object. So now we're going to talk about intransitive verbs, which are action verbs, but they don't have any kind of a receiver. So I'm going to give you some examples of what those look like, and you'll be able to see the difference right away. When we use action verbs, if you had to divide them into like a percentage, how many of them have receivers or direct objects and how many of them don't. In other words, if we had 100 different sentences with action verbs and you had to guess how many would be transitive, I would say probably 75% of the time that we use an action verb, there is a receiver. So most of the time we're talking about an action, somebody performing or doing the action, and then there being some kind of a receiver of that action. And it isn't necessarily like someone catching the ball, it's just that for someone to perform this action, there has to be an object involved, like Sam throwing the ball. Okay, so we're not talking about anybody catching it in terms of a true receiver, but we are talking about that there has to be some kind of an object involved for Sam to actually do that action of throwing something. So try to remember with transitive verbs, there's always something that action involves besides the doer of the action. Okay, so intransitive is really simple by comparison. We don't use them as frequently. But again, I'm going to turn my little board around here so you can see this. And I want to give you some examples of intransitive verbs. So remember, a transitive verb is an action verb and it cannot have a direct object in the sentence. So my first example is birds fly south for the winter. And I underline the action verb, which you can see is fly. Birds are the subject and birds are doing the flying. But you'll notice there's no direct object there. There's no receiver. You see an adverb south, which tells where they fly. And you see a prep phrase for the winter, which tells how long they are going to be there. But you have no receiver, right? You have an intransitive verb, fly. Now, if the birds were flying an airplane, then it would be transitive because the birds themselves would be flying some kind of an object. So if you had the pilot flew the plane, then you can use the verb to fly as transitive. But in this sentence, we're using it as an intransitive verb. The second example is I sat in my desk at school. So we have an action verb, sat, which is the verb to sit, it's the past tense. But we're not, there's no receiver of that. We have two prep phrases there. In my desk, which tells where, and then at school, which also tells where. So we have an intransitive verb in both of these sentences. They're both actions. Sitting is an action. but it's not transferring to any kind of an object or a receiver. So you can see the difference immediately between Sam hit the ball or Mom baked the cookies and something like this where you have birds fly south or I sat in my desk. There's no receiver even though we still have an action verb.